Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am Dusty Hosley, and I am the Associate Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at UC Santa Barbara. And as you can see here on the screen, I want to highlight quickly just a couple of programming options for you coming up in the near future. First of all, I want to especially highlight Saturdays, this coming Saturday, April 20th, a conversation with Maxine Hong Kingston, an award-winning author documenting the Chinese American experience, and Professor Erin Nin from our own Asian American Studies department, who's here with us right now. So please do come out for that. And if you find our events page online, or you can also look it up on the Asian American Studies Department website, you can RSVP for that event. And then also want to highlight for you on May 9, we'll have a roundtable panel with experts from across the country on Asian American religions and the state governments and religious freedom. And you can see a number of other events that we'll be hosting this spring. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place and all of the land upon which the university is located, and pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of this area, which has become a place of learning for people from all over the world. We're also very excited to welcome you today to this talk by Professor Russell Jeung on anti-Asian hate, racial trauma, and post-traumatic growth. And we're honored that he can be here today. The Capps Center is also grateful to our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Departments of Religious Studies and Asian American Studies, and we're proud to present this event with them. Russell Jeung is Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. He's the author of many books and articles on race and religion, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Faithful Generations, Race and New Asian American Churches, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. In 2020, Russell co-founded Stop AAPI Hate to track instances of bias, harassment, and violence against AAPI people during COVID-19, and to develop community resources and public policy to fight racism. Today's talk emerges from that work. And without further ado, please, let's all welcome Russell Jeung.
Thank you, Dusty. I'm grateful for Dusty's coordination and for the Capps Center for inviting me. It's really good to be back here at UC Santa Barbara. Professor Paul Spickard brought us here decades ago when I was a grad student myself to start an Asian Pacific American religious research initiative. And it's a network of scholars that continues to this day. So as Dusty said, I co-founded Stop AAPI Hate in 2020, and the surge of racism against Asian Americans was just vitriolic and horrendous. I was so stunned by the extent of racism against us and by the viral nature and anger of people towards Asian Americans. And so to give you a sense, I'm going to share a story, and we're going to tell the story of Noel Quintana, who was attacked during COVID-19. And as you hear his story, I'd like you to put yourself in his shoes, and I'm going to call on the students here. Tell me your emotional reaction if you were Noel. What would be a one-word feeling word, okay? All right, so this is Noel's story.
Praying the rosary with my hands. A man entered the train, but didn't really enter inside, but stood beside me. He kicked the bag that I was carrying. After a few more minutes, he kicked again my bag, and that's the time where I asked him, "What's wrong with you?" And then I moved towards the center away from him. Then he moved forward to me and slashed me, and I didn't feel it right away. When I saw a passenger so shocked, I put my hands on my face, and I felt the blood oozing. And when I looked at his hand, he was holding a box cutter. And then I realized I was cut.
Thanks. So what's your emotional reaction? Anybody? Shout out the word. Traumatizing, okay. Shocked. Violence. Anger. Saddened. One more. Fear, thanks. So you understand what Asian Americans have gone through throughout the pandemic. The words you shared, the anger, the fear, the sadness, are all trauma symptoms. And Asian Americans who experience this type of racism have been shown to have clear symptoms of racial trauma. That's 3 or more of those symptoms long-term. Anger long-term, depression long-term, avoidance of places, hypervigilance long-term. And so I'm calling COVID-19 a period of collective racial trauma. And I think all of you could relate to this. Even if you're not Asian American and experience racism, COVID itself and the pandemic was traumatizing. And so I don't know if you recognize this in yourself, feeling tired, feeling anxious, feeling agitated, feeling angry, or numb. Right? So you could all connect to this. So what I want to talk about is this collective racial trauma and how Asian Americans like Noel have responded to it. Not only, again, that we're victims of racism, but how we've resisted it. 1 out of 5 Asian Americans experienced this direct racism just in 2021. That translates to 5 million cases of hate. Because there was so much hate, 8 out of 10 Asian Americans perceived that violence against them was increasing. Not only was it widespread, but it was clearly racialized. Over half of the Stop AAPI Hate respondents were non-Chinese. People blamed China for the pandemic, but they were attacking anybody who looked Chinese, mostly East Asians. But here you could see even indigenous people were being attacked and told to go back to China. That clearly leads to, and speaks to the racialization of the virus, right? When officials used the term Chinese virus, it did 2 things. It made a biological virus Chinese, right? It imputed Chineseness to the virus, and it stigmatized the people so that Chinese were the disease carriers. So the trauma was racializing and widespread. The effects now of the trauma have been really disastrous. Not only have people died, but now over 20 studies have reported that Asian Americans' mental health went down and plummeted because of the racism. And so if any of you are in psychology classes, take down these references, and I'm writing a psychology paper for you, or you could use it in any other social science class. So this is really helpful for you to write your paper. 2/3 of us experienced mental health issues during the pandemic, including depressive symptoms, sleep difficulties, and anxiety. Because of the trauma, now 1 out of 2 Asian Americans feel unsafe because of their race. And a lot of racial groups feel unsafe because of their race, but Asians have the highest sense of fear. Asian Americans have the highest sense of lack of belonging and lack of acceptance in the US. And for you younger people were especially vulnerable and had pronounced effects. 7 out of 10 young Asian Americans said they or their family experienced racism, and those who experienced racism had higher PTSD, and half of Asian American college students. So again, think of your friends here at Santa Barbara. Half of them have increased anxiety or avoidance because of the racism. Now I want to introduce a new idea. So you've heard of racial trauma, right? Have you heard of that term? I'm going to introduce another term to you called moral injury. And I think that this period is not only one of racial trauma, but one of moral injury. And this is really pertinent for those of you who are in religious studies. And moral injury here is when your core beliefs are violated or there's a betrayal of a leader. And so moral injury has been paradigmatically investigated with Vietnam vets, because a lot of Vietnam vets had to like kill people or do things that were against their conscience, right? But I'm arguing that this period is also one of moral injury to Asian Americans, because instead of trauma, which sort of highlights the disorder of the individual who needs therapy, moral injury focuses more on the harm inflicted on the individual. And moral injury is also more appropriate because what I think is happening is that for Asian Americans, not only is this racism, but it's the acts against us are against our own moral sensibilities. That there's a whole religious and spiritual component to the racism. So you could see here, moral injury and trauma sort of overlap. They're very coexisting symptoms, but moral injury, so they both have, when you face moral injury or trauma, you face anxiety or anger. But with moral injury, because your conscience is betrayed, you often feel more shame, and that's a very Asian American distinct cultural response. You're more likely to feel alienation. You're more likely to feel enemy or a sense of normlessness. So what I'm arguing is that this period has been hard for Asian Americans because racism is basically wrong. It's against our moral value systems to be treated in this way. It's against our expectations for America to be unfair. It's wrong that elected leaders like Trump mock your group and mistreat you. So in all those ways, not only is the trauma racially discriminatory, it's morally injurious. And so, to give you an example of how we felt injured in a moral sense, Father Julian is Noel's priest, and he shared about his experience with the racism.
Asian is simply saying to us that we don't belong here. We are foreigners. I was at the grocery store, and I almost bumped into this woman. And this woman said to me, "Go back to China." For me, it's a struggle, as an immigrant. I would say that's a reality that I have to deal with every day. That part of the voices in my mind I can hear saying that I don't belong here, that you will forever be a foreigner.
So what breaks the moral hearts of Asian Americans is that they spent everything to get to America. They had American dreams, but then those dreams were violated. Those expectations were broken. Those hopes were betrayed. And here, the sense of being excluded is especially harmful for Asians who have a shame-based sort of background, and to be held out or to be excluded in that way is particularly painful. Sure. And this is being filmed. So, to really show you why, how Asians have seen this in a moral way, 3/4 of Asian American youth, we did a youth survey, 3/4 of the teenagers expressed anger as their most common emotion, and that makes sense. You face racism, you're angry because something's wrong and it's unfair. But the second highest emotional response was disappointment, which I thought was really weird. I don't know, why are you disappointed over racism? But for young people, it is disappointing because they didn't expect America to be this way. So,
I think it's terrible, absolutely terrible. I think it's demeaning to see fellow Americans ridiculing, harassing, and abusing other Asian Americans. I find it absolutely disgusting how Trump calls it the Chinese virus, which leads to more xenophobia. We should be coming together to overcome this rather than harassing people who aren't at fault.
So when you hear this teenager's point of view, it totally makes sense, their disappointment, right? Because he's younger, maybe he's naive and expecting, we're facing a pandemic, let's come together to fight the pandemic. But instead, he's shocked how American politicians are more polarizing, and harassing and blaming people rather than coming together. And that's the disappointment. That's the moral injury. So, the period has been one of racial trauma. The period has been one of moral injury. And normally, when people face trauma, they go into flight or fight response. And I hope you've heard of that. The fight response, I've heard parents giving their kids mace. Asian American gun sales have increased during the pandemic, right? That's the fight response. And Noel went into flight response. Here you could see he said he panicked. He ran out of the subway. He went out. He was scared and said, "God, why did it happen to me?" And a year later, he still walked away from people to avoid them. That's the flight response. He actually, when people were coming towards him on the sidewalk, he would actually walk on the streets because he realized, or he thought, that oncoming traffic was safer than the people and other pedestrians on the sidewalk. And he says, "I always look at my back so that there's nobody behind me to stab me." That's a trauma response, right? Fight or flight. But now I'm going to talk about how Asian Americans have responded, how Asians like Noel have used culturally responsive ways that I think are more adaptive, that are more helpful, and actually really useful for trauma and for moral injury. And again, you could use this for your psychology papers, but I think it is really interesting how the community has come around in very culturally responsive ways. And very culturally responsive ways using their Asian traditions. So the first one, instead of fighting or fleeing in the face of triggering threats, we can flock. Now think about that. It totally makes sense, right? It's a great metaphor of flocking. You can think of birds coming together or sheep coming together. Flocking in the face of danger is actually now studied to be another trauma response. And it's also called especially for women, they have a hormonal response of oxytocin that leads to the tend and befriend response. So in threats of danger, they tend and they take care of their kids first and they gather with their friends. So the tend and befriend response is the same as the flocking response, and it's now being studied. And that's the first response of Noel. You could see he says, "What helped me most was the support of my family." And he talked to them every day after the attack. He also gained the support of other people, like Father Julian, and then he began to go to rallies where they supported him, including public officials. Finally, he's in New York. Someone in LA created a GoFundMe account for him. And so he got messages from all the people who saw the videos, and they helped him a lot. So the Asian American community really came together and flocked around Noel to help him. This has now actually been studied, and social support has been the top solution favored by Asian Americans when asked what to deal with racism. And social support and flocking has been found to be a significant buffer to post-traumatic stress symptoms, depression and anxiety. So again, this flocking response is our cultural tradition. This flocking response has now been found to be actually a protective buffer against trauma symptoms. And you could see the flocking response across the country. After the Atlanta shootings, there were people held vigils, gathered in rallies to gain support from friends and allies. People flocked back to ethnic enclaves like Chinatown to support elders. Stop AAPI Hate received thousands of funds from people holding little fundraisers across the nation. And so this flocking response, I argue, was the first way to resist the racism and to seek moral recovery. The second response is developing a critical consciousness. And Asian American social psychologist Stroper argues that critical consciousness involves becoming aware of the messages that have been internalized and then taking steps individually to combat oppression. So it's two steps. becoming aware of your identity, and then taking steps to address racism. Noel, too, took those steps, developed a critical consciousness, and he says now, my mission is now to be an advocate, because most Asian victims won't speak about it. So he goes around the nation now, speaking against anti-Asian hate, and actually that's his life purpose. And again, critical consciousness now has been studied. It's amazing how quickly they've done these studies during the pandemic. Several studies have showed that developing a critical consciousness, having a strong ethnic identity, buffers and protects Asian Americans from trauma symptoms, from depression, anxiety, and other trauma symptoms. So it makes sense. If you have a strong ethnic identity, if people make fun of you for being Chinese, you don't care because you're proud about being Chinese, right? If you teach your kids, you're going to face taunts, be ready. You're not going to be as shattered or crushed or disappointed, and so you'll gain that protective coding. And so what we found at Stop AAPI Hate, we did a study of those people who reported to us, and we looked at how they felt after the incident and then after reporting. So we're arguing that reporting to Stop AAPI Hate is an example of taking a step of action against the racism. So you could see that for every symptom, hypervigilance, depression, avoidance, those symptoms decline after they report. After people take a step of action, they're able to translate their sadness into effective action. They're able to take their anger and translate it into power. And, well, actually, interestingly, the only symptom that actually increased over time was anger. That the more Asian Americans stewed over the racism they experienced, the more they realized that was wrong, that was screwed up, right? But for every other symptom, it declined. So developing a critical consciousness and taking action was a really effective way of buffering Asian Americans from the racism. And the third response is what we're calling a redemptive orientation to adversity. What Asian Americans who actually took this approach is they made meaning out of their adversity. So meaning making is a very powerful way to deal with trauma, because then you could reassess, reinterpret what happened, and instead of being controlled by your situation, you actually take control over what happened to you and try to grow from it or try to develop something redemptive from it. So for the Religious Studies Department, we're arguing that in a lot of ways, the Asian traditions help people morally reclaim the adversity of racism. It helps them to take a situation that's wrong and to see it from a different perspective. Confucianism encourages, all these traditions recognize that suffering is normal, right? So for the young Americans, when they experience racism, they're all shocked, and that's why they're so traumatized, because they weren't expecting it. But for older Asians and for immigrants, they weren't as traumatized as American-born Asians, because older immigrants have maybe more of this Asian perspective that to expect suffering. So they come to America and they go, yeah, people make fun of you. What do you expect? Duh, right? Whereas the teenagers are going, wow, that was rude. And so from Confucianism, they learn what we're trying to do is not necessarily avoid hardships, but learn to grow virtue from hardships, right? From Taoism, we learn to go with the flow and to be like water. From Buddhism, we learn self-compassion, that people shouldn't treat us that way, and we're all interconnected. So we all have something to learn, and that the people who are perpetrators are also suffering just like we are suffering. So I think a lot of older Asians and Asian immigrants employed their religious traditions to respond to the suffering rather than to be shocked by the suffering. I think this is what younger Asian Americans need to do, is they need to go back and reclaim their ethnic traditions to see what cultural wealth we have, to make it viable and usable for today's context. And Noel especially used his Catholic heritage as a response to the racism. So
Gift, because Noel opened himself to be healed by God. Healing in this case happens when we're able to forgive and let go. You know, God graced him that gift of forgiveness so that he can forgive his assailant and at the same time move on. And hopefully somewhere, you know, down the line, that there will be an opportunity for them to meet each other and say, "Why did you hurt me?"
for Noel, he experienced probably the worst trauma you can face, getting slashed. He went into flight response, he panicked, and today he has trauma symptoms of avoidance. But because he's able to forgive his perpetrator, he's able to actually move on and let go. And that's super powerful. Rather than holding on to the anger and letting the anger burn inside, he's able to channel that anger into forgiveness and channel that anger into advocacy, which he does. And that's a real gift, right? Forgiveness is not necessarily for the perpetrator. Forgiveness is for Noel to let go of the anger. And what Father Julian suggests is that someday there'll be restorative justice. That someday Noel could meet his perpetrator and at least understand, why did you hurt me? And I've heard that a lot from Asian American victims. They don't want to punish their perpetrators. They didn't report to Stop AAPI Hate to get their rights redressed. They just want to understand what happened. It's part of that redemptive orientation towards adversity. They just want to know why it happened, and they wanted to educate their perpetrators to understand how it harmed them. So this, again, has been studied. Having this positive, redemptive orientation to adversity has been studied and found to be actually effective. Those who could find positive meaning during the pandemic were less likely to become depressed. So if you're going through midterms and finals now and you're anxious and depressed, if you can make meaning out of your studies, if you could take a step back and reflect on why are you learning and in school, it actually helps you, it protects you. Put meaning into your studies and just don't do it for the grades. They also found that Asian Americans who had a positive sense of diversity were able to handle bicultural stress. This is actually interesting. They found that 1.5 and second generation Asian Americans are more likely to be bicultural, so they could understand their parents' culture and they could understand their mainstream American culture. That gave them what is called cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is when you could take a situation like a racial incident and look at it from different perspectives, right? Because they're used to looking at things from their parents' angle, from their own angle, they could see things from different sides. And in the same way, people with cognitive flexibility can experience a racial incident and understand, why did the perpetrator do it? What did I do to stand out? What did the system do to create the racism? And that understanding, that cognitive flexibility, actually gave them a better understanding of the racism and were better able to handle it. Got it? So for a lot of you who are second generation, this is your superpower. You have cognitive flexibility that just comes from growing up as an Asian American. So in conclusion, we've gone through a period of collective racial trauma that's been really horrendous, that's been really palpably painful. But most people don't suffer from traumatic disorder afterwards. Most people come out of it well and actually stronger. And actually, all of you have come out of the pandemic too, and you've probably come out of the pandemic stronger as well. And that's what we call post-traumatic growth, the growth that occurs after you've gone through a traumatizing period. So think about this for yourself as you've gone through and survived the pandemic, or if you survived the racism. First of all, people who've gone through trauma, like, this is mostly studied of people who survived like jet crashes or war. First of all, there's a newfound gratefulness for life. right? We survived the pandemic and we didn't get COVID and die. And not only are we grateful, but now we have new possibilities for life. So a lot of people who go through life-threatening incidents, they reassess the meaning of their life, like, woo, I just made it. I survived a jet crash. I survived COVID. I survived this racism. What now can I do given the limited time that I have left, right? And that's why I was talking about retirement early, because like, if I only got like a few more years, what am I doing with teaching? Well, anyway. People realize that they have more personal strength than they think, right? You have resilience, and that's why we say at every graduation now, after the pandemic, congratulations, you've made it through. You've graduated, and you've graduated through the pandemic. Another thing that's grown after the trauma is empathy. And this is really powerful. For Asian Americans who've gone through racism during the pandemic, they now better understand racial profiling. So they could have empathy with other marginalized groups who face being profiled for being dangerous, who are profiled for being outsiders, who are profiled and then have their families separated at the borders. I think because of the racial trauma, Asian Americans hopefully have developed a greater empathy and understanding for those who also face discrimination. And for a lot of people, again, who've gone through life-threatening situations, they have new spiritual purpose. And again, for religious studies people, this is really relevant. God's teaching us something from these experiences. What does God want me to know? How can I serve God better? So I really like this idea because when you think about racial trauma, it's often talked about in Western terms. People often use biomedical understandings for racial trauma. You go through trauma, so you have a mental illness, so you need individual therapy. Got that? Trauma leads to illness. Illness means individual therapy. That's a very individualistic Western model. But we know that Asian Americans don't normally go to mental health services. It's not because it's stigmatized. It's just because it doesn't make conceptual sense for us to understand. Because adversity is actually, if adversity and suffering is normalized, you don't think of racism as an illness. You think of it as something to overcome. Racial trauma is something to grow from. And that's how we lead to post-traumatic growth. So again, be glad you've overcome the pandemic. You've gained all these new things, and you could tell your mom or your dad, look what I've learned. And I think that our Asian backgrounds are really helpful for moral recovery to moral injury and to restore the justice that we seek. In seeking moral recovery, we first of all invite people to dialogue. You saw how Noel and Father Julian wanted to speak to their perpetrator. I know a lot of Asian American victims actually want the chance to speak to perpetrators. Monthanis Ratnapaki, her father was killed in San Francisco. He was an 84-year-old Thai man. She just asked, I wish I could talk to the perpetrator. And in the whole justice system, she's been separated from him. She can't even meet with the judge. She can't talk to the perpetrator. And Monthanis just says, I wish I could just understand what happened. She doesn't want to punish him. She just wants to understand, why did my father die? And that's the invitation to dialogue. Moral recovery really means truth-telling and naming the harm. And I think that's the power of Stop AAPI Hate, just giving people a public platform to say this is wrong. Again, people didn't want individual redress when they reported. They just wanted to bring the community together and say, stop this racism. But part of the moral recovery needed is the making of amends. And I really learned this from the 12-step program, where part of the 12 steps is that you need to make amends for the harms you've conducted. And again, making amends isn't for the victim. Making amends is for the perpetrator, right? That gives them an opportunity to show that they've changed. That gives them a way to make things right. Most of all, for moral recovery, and I think this is, again, a very Asian way of thinking, the primary goal is a reaffirmation of right relationships. And so, again, a lot of the Asian traditions for Buddhism, for Confucianism, for a lot of Pacific Islander traditions is right relationships with the land, right relationships with others, right relationships with society. And along with those right relationships are the offering of second chances. These are all steps in restorative justice. These are all steps of moral recovery. These are all steps encouraged by our Asian traditions. So Santa Barbara students, I hope you can morally recover from the pandemic. For Asian Americans, I hope we can morally recover. And then once we're healed, once we've been repaired, we can help repair America. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have time for Q&A, and Philip, you've got the other microphone, so I will come over there and bring the microphone around. Because this is being recorded, please wait to ask your question until you've got the microphone, and then hold it close to your lips so that we can capture the sound of your voice.
So this is a photo of the May We Gather events held by Buddhists and Duncan Williams from USC. And they've brought together Buddhists from all Asian ethnicities. They had over 40 different Buddhist priests come, and they were at a temple that was vandalized during the pandemic. And during the ceremony, they had a lotus blossom that was broken. And what each priest did is that they repaired the lotus blossom with gold inlay and reset it. And this is a Japanese art form, kintsugi, right? And so this just sort of is a metaphor for the moral repair of the community, that what is broken, our racial relations, can be repaired and actually made more beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name's Ladia. I live in Santa Barbara as a community member. Thank you for the talk. I just wonder what happened to Noel's perpetrator. Was the person ever caught? And what were the witnesses like? Were they helpful in identifying? Did they want to kind of not get involved and not speak up? So part of it, being reporting is also have the courage to stand up for victims that you see that's been perpetrated. And I wonder if you had any commentate about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia, and thanks for coming. That's a great question. I don't even know what happened to the perpetrator. But I know what happened during the event is actually Noel said, when I said help, nobody helped me. And in the Stop AAPI Hate reports, a lot of people mentioned no one stopped to help. And that's part of the moral injury, too, is that the lack of intervention meant to the Asians that others condoned the racism. And it is really painful to be betrayed by your community. And so I think the lack of help, the lack of intervention, again, was even sometimes more injurious. So I don't know what happened to the perpetrator, but I should look it up. Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, get her, and then someone way over here. I was going to make Dusty move.
Hey. Hi, this is now working. Okay, perfect. Hi, thank you so much for that talk, and apologies for coming in late. So this question might be related to topics that I may have missed at the beginning of the talk. But I'm wondering, especially on the last slide and towards the end when you're giving these kind of opportunities for us to rethink spirituality and religion and its role in redemptive and moral justice. And so I'm wondering I have kind of a two-part question, if that's okay. The first part is, like, what do you mean or who do you mean when you say Asian? Particularly because I think, the nodes that you talked about were Buddhism and Taoism and things like that, which I think is deeply Eastern, like a very East Asian kind of approach. So I'm wondering if there is space to consider, say, like other religious traditions within Asia. And also, I come from a Vietnamese American background that is deeply evangelical and deeply kind of like a Protestant Christian tradition that came from Vietnam to the United States. This was not like a conversion that happened here. And so the last slide that I noticed that you presented on were all things that I guess I kind of learned when I was growing up and going to church. within the kind of Christian tradition. But then I also understand, moral recovery, restorative justice. I also understand that some of these same traditions can reproduce harms, and particularly systems of white supremacy. And so I wonder, from my background, right, I notice that there are kind of lines of a very like white supremacist or white prioritizing type of ideology within my own Asian family, right? So I'm wondering how we take that into consideration with this kind of moral recovery and restorative justice, right? So it's like, these are all things that I have learned like in my own religious upbringing, but yet I understand that my religious upbringing can create these kind of tensions and divisions. And so how do we consider those things together?
Great questions. So the Asian question, I should always preface every talk, and every Asian American studies book prefaces like, Asian America is a diversity of, many cultures and generations of backgrounds and diversity. So I just say Asian as anybody who claims to be Asian can be Asian, and it can be included to be Asian. It's sort of a self-defined term. And yeah, my examples are East Asian, and I should put a footnote from my East Asian orientation. I just use these traditions as examples, but there's probably more examples from Sikh traditions, from Hindu traditions. But the question about Christianity is really interesting. I'm writing a book on anti-Asian hate and the yellow peril and how we've been excluded for being a threat. And I just went to a really interesting talk that, that America is seen as the city on the hill, the New Jerusalem. That New Haven, the city in Connecticut, it's actually built in the same dimensions as New Jerusalem in Revelations in the Bible, the exact measurements. So they really saw themselves as New Jerusalem. And New Jerusalem in Revelations actually has walls, right, to keep in the pure and the people of God, and to keep outside those who don't belong. And all those on the outside were dogs, sexually immoral, liars, and they were all the exact stereotypes placed on Asians to exclude them in the 19th century. So this speaker, Jan Janlin, drew the strong parallel that those excluded from the city of God were the same people excluded from the United States because we share the same characteristics as Asians, as enemies of God. And so Asians were excluded not only because we were economic competition to white workers, and not only because we're invading hordes, but also because we were heathen pagans who were enemies of God. And so Catherine Jin Lum writes about that, but I think that part of the yellow peril, that we're a threat to America's morality, isn't written about a lot enough or discussed about. So Christian nationalism really drove the yellow peril discourse and the anti-Asian hate, and continues today, right? The reason why there's bumper stickers that say, heaven has walls, so why doesn't America, right? And so that Christian heritage, Christian nationalism is really the primary source, I think, of a lot of the racism against a lot of groups. And, again, Christian nationalism is the strongest predictor of a lot of racial and political attitudes in the US now. So it's really, it's sort of parallel. Yeah, they actually say that. To justify the wall at the border, you say, look at heaven. Yeah, no, it's like in Texas or, I don't know, Arizona. So Christianity has both the roots of the racism, but can also have, again, both and some of the sources of the redemption for America. And so part of my book is that a lot of the racial discourses are always either or, right? It's us versus them. And since Asians are the out-group, we are excluded. Since African Americans are the out-group, they're put on the bottom. And what we need are more Taoist both and approaches, right? And so I borrow from a lot of Taoist thinking that, Christianity is both a source of racism and a possibility for redemptive, uses. In the same way, Asian Americans are both victims of racism, but we're also perpetrators of racism and complicit in racism and anti-Black. And so Stop AAPI Hate is both stopping the hate against Asians and the hate of Asians. And so for me, taking that both and approach, I think is really helpful in disrupting the binaries that underwrite racism in America. And also underwrite the religious antagonisms that are sort of causing a lot of problems.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really appreciate it. And as I understand it, the Chinese character for crisis also means opportunity. So I think that's, you know, the roots of where that might come from. I was thinking about a third category when you talk about fight or flight. That binary is fight or flight or freeze, because often, you know, we'll do that and not know what to do under the circumstances that may arise. So there's that freeze is that third category. And my question is, what can we do about the systemic challenges that we have towards, like that you spoke of, about punitive actions that tend to be the response of the system rather than, you know, all the other options for communication and reparations, and et cetera. But to get past the punitive aspects of the systemic problems.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think the source of racism, again, is both the yellow peril narrative and the systemic policies that flow from it, right? And so I think the making amends, naming the harm, and naming that a lot of the harm is the yellow peril stereotype, at least for Asians, and the racist policies to exclude. And then making amends is to change those policies, right? To have educational systems that teach Asian American studies, that have not necessarily more hate crime punishment, but actually more opportunities for dialogue and restorative justice, right? And so I think we need systemic change in order to address the issue. Going to the fight, flight, or flop. Yeah, I freeze all the time. That's sort of my natural response, I think. And then the other thing people do is, never mind, I won't go on to it. But yeah, there's a lot of trauma responses. There's fight or flight and freeze, and then people fawn. And that's why a lot of Asians go into this fawning. We're afraid of authority, so we'll just be really obsequious and, you know, become small. That's a trauma response that they say has been colonized, or part of our colonization. So there's a lot of trauma responses. I really like the flocking one, so I'm claiming that one. But yeah, I think we need systemic and structural change. And I should actually maybe highlight that as part of the moral recovery process. This thing is all new. People don't think of moral injury in this way. They don't think of racism as a moral issue. And then how to make things right, how to repair our morals in our society is sort of an interesting question, right? You know, like, this rebuilds trust among individuals. Can we rebuild trust in American institutions when people of color feel so excluded, right? Do we want to rebuild trust, or should we? So it makes me think. Trauma is a fear-based symptom. Moral injury is a betrayal-based syndrome. And so if you're betrayed, you need to restore trust. But do we want to restore trust in America? Should we? Young people, do you have any trust in your systems and in authorities? Like, no, so it's a good question to ask. Or I'm sort of worried about.
Hi, is this working? Okay, first off, I just want to like clarify, I'm an undergrad. I've never been to this kind of lecture before, so I'm sorry if like I'm not doing this right. But I was wondering if you have any insight on like how basically different areas of the U.S., like different geography, how that may have affected like maybe like the different prevalence of hate crimes, or the different intensity of attack, or even something like, you know, like different responses from the local communities or local governments. because I used to live in South Dakota, in Montana, where the Asian population is like 1%, which is very different, of course, from California or. So it's kind of like I have been wondering like how much a role geography and location play on like, I guess like how Asian Americans are accepted in our community, how the pandemic affected all of that. I don't know, just like geography, like if that played a role.
That's a great question. You should write a paper on it. Everything is, you should write a paper on it. Yeah, you want to answer?
I did a little bit of research on this, and from what I read, it is counterintuitive, actually, that a lot more of, disproportionately more, far disproportionately more, of the attacks happened in what we think of as liberal bastions, so cities like New York and San Francisco, and that in areas where there weren't that many Asians, it just wasn't enough for people to be hostile and in that kind of active capacity. And so I think the sense of betrayal is in that sense even deeper, right? That where we think we are safest, we were least.
Yeah, we couldn't use Stop AAPI Hate data because it's self-reported. And so more reports came from densely Asian populations because Asians there have a higher sense of collective consciousness and are more likely to report. So I think that, yeah, a lot of hate incidents occurred in dense public places because that's where people came in close public contact with other Asians, or with Asians, not other Asians. It's because people were on subways and buses with us and they were afraid of getting COVID, that they're more likely to strike at us or to avoid us. But if you're in South Dakota, you don't see another person for 30 miles and it's like, go back to China, and it's like far away in a car. It's like, you're not going to report that because it's, so I think national surveys say it happens everywhere, right, the racism, but we just got more reports from Asians, from Asian communities, at least Stop AAPI Hate. Other studies, and they just do a Google search on this. Clearly, Republican counties have higher rates of anti-Asian hate on Twitter and in incidents in prejudice. So that's been correlated. And Christian nationalist counties have been proven to be a little bit more racist.
I'm a pastor in a Japanese American church and lived in Japan about 19 years. And to me, Christian nationalism is not really biblical Christianity. And so I think it's very harmful. And in our church, even though about 2/3 are Japanese descent, we do have African Americans and Hispanics, and we try to emphasize from Revelation that says there will be people from every tribe, nation, and tongue around the throne of God, and that I was just wondering if there's an effort to bring the different minority groups in America together, if that would be a help, because that's kind of a goal in our church. The other thing was, in Japan, I was surprised to hear you say that people didn't expect to encounter racism here, because people in Japan always told me, boy, you're a very racist country in America. And I said, yes, it is a problem, because they were very familiar with the civil rights battles of the 60s and things. And to me, more Americans are ignorant of our history of racism than foreigners at times. But I was curious if you think trying to get all the minority groups more mingling together would be a solution.
Yeah, I think that is really helpful. So the idea of white supremacy, that it doesn't impact people of color, I think is sort of erroneous, that African Americans could adopt a white supremacist thinking, Asians could adopt white supremacist thinking. It doesn't mean like whites are superior, it just means we can have perspectives and implicit biases against people of color, because that's sort of the environment that we're around, that we get these ideas. So even myself, if I saw an Asian person wearing a mask coming down the street early in COVID and a non-Asian walking down without a mask, I'd be more scared of the Asian, right? Because they're more likely to have COVID just because of the way it came from China. And so even I had that implicit bias, right? And so I think we're all sort of susceptible to racist thinking, and that's why it's both and, right? We're all complicit in this system. And that's why getting communities of color together for Asians to combat their anti-blackness and for blacks to confront their anti-Asianness would be really helpful. And I think I've seen a lot of coalitional works to do so now. And what happened during COVID for the Asian American community is the media portrayed a lot of hate crimes because that's what gets on the news, not the normal hate incidents where we're shunned or just harassed, but the crimes. And you don't know, actually, if they were hate crimes because nothing was said. We were just like victims of robbery or victims of homicide. But they're calling it a hate crime just because it happened during this period. And then oftentimes the perpetrators were African American because they were in urban settings, right? And so they're not showing the violent crime against black on black, but it's more spectacular. You gain more of an audience to show black on Asian crime. And so the Asian American community began to pick up on that and said, oh, anti-Asian hate is perpetrated by African Americans, and we should really focus on that. And that just led to, again, it perpetuates the criminalization of African Americans, and the push for hate crime enforcement leads to, again, more policing of the communities. And so other parts of the Asian American community say it's not about hate crimes, that's more sensationalized. We need to come together in solidarity to address the racism that both groups face. We have to come together to, create community safety for both groups where we all live together. And so I think coming together really is necessary and continues to be necessary. Yeah? I'll tell you. No, it's for the Zoom people. Remind me to tell you my my insider Asian black crime story. It's interesting.
My name is Therese, and I'm a Santa Barbara community member, lived here for a long time. I wanted to address what is being done in the Santa Barbara community to bring together people of all color. So I'm one of the founders, I think my husband, my friend. We have the Santa Barbara Association of Santa Barbara County. That was formulated about 4 or 5 years ago. We bring people together to celebrate Chinese New Year, Dragon Boat Festival, it's a potluck. The other thing that I have also have been involved in from the beginning, under a nonprofit in Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. If those of you who are not familiar with Santa Barbara, there is areas where the Chinese and Japanese lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Cannon Perdido. It looks like you're a Santa Barbara person. So what we have done under the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation, we have an Asian American affinity group. And we're going into our 15th year of hosting the Asian American Film Series in July, and the Asian American Neighborhood Festival in October. And we bring people together. And these films, we are always showing films that, right now our committee is looking at films that discusses internment issues, socialization. So we look at films from all of the Asian American films only, not foreign films. And in October, for our Asian American Neighborhood Festival, we bring a lot of different performers together, whether it could be the gamelan group from Indonesia, taiko drumming, the lion dance, martial arts. These are things in our community that brings people together. And it also, I think what the pastor was saying, bringing more awareness. And I think one of our ways, we agree with flocking. A lot of our friends came together during COVID to talk about what we were feeling. But we also continued with these programs because we feel that these are the things that brings the community together. We cannot hide. We are here. We belong here. And so if you have these programs wherever you're at, join them. Be a part of it. lectures. I saw your ad in Independent. We wanted to come and listen to you, so it's great. Talk about other opportunities you may speak to in other groups in Santa Barbara. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming and having us talk. I had a question about, I remember this talk made me think about a long time ago when I was talking to my mom and she told me about some sort of trauma that she had, and I feel like for me, it was like very big, like, oh, I wanted her to realize that for her, she thought that, oh, this was a big opportunity to grow, and she was kind of frustrated why she wasn't growing and stuff like that. And I said, well, I don't think that you should, necessarily blame yourself for whatever happened. I think you should blame, the person that did it to you. But I feel like she had a hard time doing that. And so for me, I just realized, I was like, oh, I think this is kind of like an intergenerational kind of her way of seeing how she should deal with trauma and how I think kind of the world works. And I'm like, oh, those people are bad and they did a bad thing too. So I guess within kind of moral recovery and this idea of naming harm, have you noticed kind of an intergenerational kind of, intergenerational kind of difference between kind of second-gen Asian Americans versus immigrants and how they deal with trauma, racial trauma?
Yeah, it's a great question. Is how do Asians deal with trauma, right? And I think your mom's response of looking inward and self-blaming, like, why did this bad thing happen to me? What did I do wrong? It's sort of like, what's my karma, right? Like, what did I do wrong to deserve this suffering? And in some ways, it's good because then you take responsibility and say, I'm not going to be that way in the past, right? It's sort of like a guilt/shame response. You regret what you did, and so you'll become a better person. But what happens when what happened wasn't your fault, but someone else? But we still self-blame even then when it wasn't our fault, right? And so, what do you call that when you blame yourself for something you didn't do? Or, yeah, you blame the victim. Yeah. And so that happens a lot, and that happens in shame-based cultures. And so we're always feeling bad for ourselves, and that's why we shrink, because that's a response from shame. We avoid, we hide. But the new generations, I don't know about here, but my students are all into mental health, and they're all like crying all the time in my classes and saying, my therapist said, and they're like really open about it. And so I think it's a big generational transition, right? So I want a blend of both, that our younger generation should learn from the older generation should learn from the younger generation, to have that dialogue and to learn the strengths from each. Again, I think a lot of our traditions have a lot of strength. And so to say we need therapy and self-care is true, but to also say we need community care and collective. Unless we deal with the trauma now, we're going to take this period of trauma and pass it, the pain and the sorrow and the anger, down to our other kids. So hurt people. My dad was hurt. He hurt me. I now hurt people around me, sadly. But healed people, right? And so if we could be healed at this moment, then we could be, as Asian Americans, part of the healing community that helps heal the rest of America. So that's my hope. All right, wait. You want to hear my, okay, here, I got to tell you my crime story, all right? So this is a Black Asian thing. So in Oakland, you should cut off the Zoom. A 61-year-old dentist was shot in a robbery. And so she was killed in her car. And so her family said, oh, another example of anti-Asian hate. So the community came together. I went to the vigil. I spoke at the vigil. We had all these pastors. We had Black pastors, and we had Chinese pastors. And we said, this isn't a Black Asian thing. This is a violence thing, right? And so the community really came together. The city council member, we held vigils, lit candles. And then later we found out that it wasn't the person they arrested, but actually the dentist's boyfriend ordered a hit on his girlfriend, and he claimed anti-Asian hate as an alibi to mask his own murder. Isn't that evil? And then he commits suicide in prison, and he actually hired his friend So it wasn't anti-Asian hate, is Asian black friendship that helped kill his girlfriend. And I heard about this because I get my hair cut like in that neighborhood, and my hairstylist, she's sitting there and cutting my hair, and she goes, yeah, we knew about that, because she knew all the video footage that all the store owners share the video footage, and they saw that guy, the killer, was there for an hour. So it wasn't, he could have killed anybody and robbed anybody, but they knew that he was waiting for her, right? And you go, if you knew that, how come you don't tell the police? And she just sort of shrugs, right? But yeah, so anti-Asian hate became an alibi for other crimes. Isn't that interesting? It's like harrowing. His kids say, yeah, our dad's a sociopath, and it's a really weird story.
Thank you. Well, I understand what you talked about, wanting to speak to your perpetrator and have a redemptive moral healing from that very inner self perspective. But if you think about it, people who perpetrate these kind of racial injustices are not rational. And in my case, I happen to know the person who was committing aggression towards me. And when pressed about why did you, go back to where you come from, your blah, 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 racial, gender slurs, he claims that he didn't mean for me to go back to China. He wanted me to just go back to Chicago. And how does that going back to Chicago be okay? Back to Chicago, Chinatown, maybe? I don't understand. So it became clear to me, talking to these people, I'm not getting anywhere. And then when it's pushed some more, he justified himself for doing all this because he said, I stole a rock. And that was the end of my conversation with him. I don't know where I'm trying to go. So I'm not quite sure, in your perspective, in the ultimate confrontation, what would be gained from talking to these kind of perpetrators, and what kind of additional healing might you feel that you can gain?
Thanks for ripping the idea of restorative justice, but that's the problem of it, right? So you need to hold people accountable too, right? Restorative justice doesn't mean we just talk and then everything's all happy and we're friends again. They're still held accountable for their actions, but the dialogue gives the victim a chance and have a voice in the process, whereas most of our justice system, they're silenced. And the hope is that the perpetrator will learn from it and make amends, right? And so they'll say they're sorry and want to change, but in your case, he didn't, right? And so it wasn't a restorative justice process, it just didn't work. And that could happen a lot, and that's when other justice systems kick in. But the best case scenario is that we just don't lock them up and never see them again, which actually leads to more hate and continues the racism. You got to stop the racism somehow, and hopefully we got to educate people so that they make change, right? And we need, as Asians, need to look in ourselves too and make the change first. I feel like a Michael Jackson song, but yeah. So it's both and that the process gives Asians a voice, and a lot of times Asians don't even want the voice. We don't want to say anything because we're so avoidant. And it's good for Asians to actually share what's wrong, to verbalize it, to express the pain, I think, because again, it externalizes it, as I adopt Western perspectives on therapy.
We'll have time for this question here, and I also would like to take privilege and ask a question, and then I think we'll end the conversation today.
Thanks for doing this presentation. I've really enjoyed it. My name's John Walker, and I was thinking about the young lady's question over there about the prevalence. Like if it's in certain areas more than others. I just want to share. Okay, so my father is American. He's from New Hampshire. He was in the Air Force, and my mom is from Okinawa. They met at Kadena Air Force Base in Japan, and I'm 57 years old. And over the last 3 decades, I've never experienced any racial attacks or anything like that. But in high school, when I was in high school back in the early 1980s, I graduated in '84. My last 3 years of high school, I did experience a lot of, like, I guess you would call it racism, for being a Japanese American. And I really think the reason, and you won't hear this anywhere really, but I really think the reason behind it was because of all the programming from Hollywood. Like, I mean, I just remember watching all these movies like Tora, 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 or Midway, or, you know, these Pearl Harbor movies. And man, I really felt bad going into school the very next day after those movies were released. And I would get teased, and I would get called names, and but I never really, you know, at the time, I never really correlated the two. And so I think, you know, to your question about the prevalence, I think it makes a big difference on what people are watching, like what people in North Dakota are watching, what programming, if they're watching Fox News, if they're watching certain movies, it really affects their behavior and thinking. And so, you know, you mentioned in your slide about Trump mentioning the China virus. I mean, if he's saying that multiple times, people are going to think that, you know. And so when they look at a Chinese American, you know, they're just going to kind of think that because it's in their heads. So I think a lot of it has to do with the mass, you know, media programming that's out there, and that everyone is watching in their living room, in their bedroom every single day. So, I mean, your question just kind of made me think about that, but just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm part of the study, and they ask a national sample, name a famous Asian American. And over half of Americans couldn't name anybody. So who do you think is the most famous Asian American named by people? Bruce Lee, number 2. He's not American, but yeah. Number 1, most famous Asian American? Jackie Chan, very good. You have the pulse on middle of America. So even though our president is Asian, our vice president is Asian American, you know, she was barely named. So half of America can't name a famous Asian American. So part of it is the invisibility that leads to this thinking that they don't belong in America, we could exclude them. But the few representations are, for women, are fetishized and hypersexualized. And that's why you see the Atlanta shootings, where this guy with a sex addiction goes and kills those at Asian massage parlors. He says it's not racially motivated, but you have to suspect why, if he had a sexual addiction, he could have gone anywhere. Why did he drive out of his way to go shoot up an Asian massage parlor? Why did he want to kill the temptation there versus the temptation anywhere else? So I think, yeah, media representations really do shape our implicit bias and our thinking. Relatedly, the study asked, name a famous or an important Asian American historical event or policy. They couldn't name anything, you know. It's like, so, yeah, we're sort of invisible to most Americans. But the few images, I think most of the Hollywood representations of Asian women were as prostitutes before Crazy Rich Asians. So now we're just either Crazy Rich or, yeah. But she wants to make one last. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So just kind of adding on to your, like, what you were saying earlier about, like, the mass media. I mean, obviously I'm not a scholar, but from my own lived experience, I think also, like, how non-Asians react to, like, Asian Americans has to do with kind of, like, the level of assimilation or acculturation the Asian community in that area has. Because I know when I lived in South Dakota, okay, so first, I actually calculated the numbers. There were 300 Chinese people in the city I lived in. It was the largest city. So that's not very big. And what I grew up around was that all of the Asian Americans I knew were, like, very recent immigrants, not completely fluent in English, usually arrived on, like, something like an H-1B visa, you know, because, you know, nobody really chooses to move to South Dakota if they're over there. It's usually because, you know, they finally got an employer in South Dakota who was willing to sponsor them in the U.S. So basically, they weren't very well assimilated with the rest of the city, and it kind of like, it's very hard to establish dialogue between different communities when, like you have a language barrier, you have like that huge cultural barrier, and then when I came here, suddenly there was like I met 5th generation Japanese Americans. I'm like, oh my God, I never knew that was a thing. There's like a lot more of like a, like a more, I guess like more generations, more roots over here on the West Coast, and like a lot of people, like a lot more Asian Americans who are like fluent in English, who like could go past that like cultural barrier, just like a lot more well integrated. So I guess like, like the mass media thing is definitely like a factor, but I would also add like the assimilation thing too, and like how like the different areas people live in, and like how I guess the immigration system kind of like plays into that too.
Actually, North and South Dakota are proportionally the highest growing Asian American migration states in the United States right now. So to discount the Midwest as like a specific, like, aberration because there's not a lot of people there, there's a certain type of ideology that holds true against, say, the West Coast, I think is being deeply challenged these days.
Respond?
Yeah, I've got a response to everything. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it's a really good point. The level of acculturation makes a difference of how well we're accepted. But, so Asian Americans think that we should belong here, right? And those born here have a higher idea that we should belong. And people with higher educations and higher wealth feel like they should belong more. We earned it, right? We were born here. We make a lot of money here. We were schooled here. But in terms of level of acceptance across class, we all feel unaccepted, which is really interesting, which shows you may feel like you belong here because you make a lot of money, you're well educated, you're really acculturated, but you don't feel accepted. That even if you feel like me, 5th generation, highly educated Asian, I feel like I deserve to be American. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be not American, but I know I'm not accepted. So it's both and that. Even if you acculturate, you still don't have acceptance, right? Because of race. And so that's the scary thing. But yeah. But at least I live in San Francisco where there's boba every 2 stores.
I think we'll end it on boba. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Russell.